I'm Justine.
And I'm Kimberly.
And our functional area is Judicial Affairs.
So another word for Judicial Affairs, which we hear a lot more commonly on campuses, is student conduct. And so this is the office or professional or even area, depending on the institution size, that handles all the disciplinary processes after a student violates the university's code of conduct. And something that was reinforced a lot during our interviews was that it's a learning opportunity for students and a lot of development, and not so much the law. So in some of our research, we found that they compare it to like the university taking over as the parent figure as opposed to like the law, if that makes sense.
So jurisdiction is just a fancy term for what type of meetings would you come across as a student conduct professional. Some of these you would come across, maybe not all, but these are some of the most common. First being academic integrity. You might see people for sexual misconduct, alcohol and drug violations, with alcohol being the most common break in conduct. Vandalism, theft. Sometimes you might deal with conflicts, specifically roommate disputes, and there are other things that you would see students for, but these are the most common. So the general process of student conduct is first a report needs to be submitted. This can be submitted by RAs, by police, faculty, or by students as well. A lot of schools are moving to like online submissions for students. And then after that, you need to contact that student, letting them know a report has been sent in, and generally you set up a one-on-one meeting. The student has the option to not go to that meeting, but you can make a decision whether they are there or not, or they can decide to get out of the one-on-one meeting and go in front of a hearing board instead. Most students opt for the one-on-one meeting. After that, if you find them responsible, you give them sanctions, which are essentially goals that you have. Through our interviews, the educational approach was the biggest approach that they had as far as goals, educating versus consequence. You follow up on those sanctions to make sure they're complete. And then another thing about the hearing board, if they opt out of hearing board, another way that you might use it is if they're up for suspension or if they're a multiple offender, then oftentimes they move to hearing board instead of one-on-one meeting.
And those hearing boards are usually, it depends on the institution that if they even have one. I know Concordia doesn't have a hearing panel, but it is usually faculty, staff, and students, and there's a large pool, and then they keep about 4 to 5.
And then if you're going to be doing a one-on-one meeting, there are some tips that we got from our interviewees. First is to build rapport. That helps make the student feel comfortable. If the student feels comfortable, they're more likely to open up to you, to be honest with you, so you can have a good one-on-one meeting. Also, you should explain the process to them. Often they're nervous and they think you're there to make quick judgments. That is not what you're there for. Make sure you give them their rights. Under law, you have to tell them their rights. Also, be a detective. If you feel they're not telling you the truth or there are things missing, question, question, question. Like, that is your main job. Also, you can show vulnerability. If you've gone through a similar situation, you can say, I know, like, I got in trouble for a similar thing or this or that. That's okay to share that. And also make sure that you show that you understand them, you're on their level. Follow up with any questions if you're confused. Follow up summarizing what they said. And then make sure that you focus on the future. How can this impact you in your future so the reality of what they did can kind of sink in a little bit.
So there's different types of sanctions that students can receive. It can be a warning, probation, suspension, expulsion, etc. And then a lot of educational sanctions, which I think are attempted to be used a lot, is a reflective paper or community service. And so in one of our interviews at Hamlin, Javier had stated that if a student was talking about their future like profession, he said, okay, stop. Why don't you go back and reflect on how this might affect your future and your future career? So write me an essay, and that will be your disciplinary process for getting caught drinking on campus. And then status sanctions would be fines, restrictions, the termination of the housing contract if there's too many offenses, and they're putting themselves or students around them in danger.
So we are going to try our best to do a mock meeting. Again, we are not professionals, and we are trying to cram a meeting that would probably be a half an hour to hour to like 5 minutes.
So, we talk a lot.
So that's quite a lot. I'll be the Dean of Students, and Kimberly will be the student that violated the on-campus alcohol policy. Look for how I explain the rights, my approach, but mostly pay attention. you will be picking the sanctions for Kimmy. And then here you go. This is the incident report. I will not read the incident report to you. You'll get some of that information as we talk. You can look up here. So we're not going to do the introductions. The build report will be very short, but we'll stop in between and explain.
So you want a 1-minute warning after?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, hi Kimberly.
Hi.
I'm glad that you decided to meet with me today. Before we get started, how about you just kind of tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am originally from the Twin Cities area. I'm a marketing major. I live in the dorms with my friend from high school, and I don't know, I just like listening to music.
How has your transition to college been for you?
It's been good. I've been having a lot of fun, meeting a lot of people.
Okay, wonderful. Well, before we get everything started, I just want to talk to you about your rights before we even dive into anything. So, you have the right to confidentiality. As you saw, we asked you to leave your bag, your cell phone, everything outside of this meeting to ensure that nothing is recorded. What we say is kept here. You will be put on file, but only those in the student conduct office can see it. So, if anyone else finds out about what we talked about today, that's with what you're comfortable sharing with other people. You also have the right to appeal. If you feel that the outcome today is not correct, you can talk to me about the appeal process and I can help you through that. So, okay, wonderful. So basically, to get started, I just want you to talk about that night. I'm not going to read the incident report. This is where you'd probably tell them the report. I'm not going to do that. It's up there. So then you would talk to them about this. If you just tell me about that incident, and then I'll just ask some questions as we go out. Does that sound good?
Yeah, so it was really cold last weekend, and my roommate and I and 2 of our friends from down the hallway just decided we didn't want to walk out in the cold because we felt like that was a lot more harmful or unsafe for us to do, and we just wanted to kind of hang out, so we decided to have a few drinks in our dorm, and we were just listening to music and not being very loud, and the RA heard clinking, and which could have been a number of things in my opinion, but she knocked on the door and kind of barged in to ask questions, but yeah, we just didn't want to go out in the cold.
Okay. So did you know the people that you were like in the dorm with, watching movies with?
It was my roommate and 2 of our friends.
Okay. And that night, were you just kind of getting together to watch movies and then started drinking, or what was kind of the plan for hanging out that night?
I mean, I think our original intent was to go find a party, but like I said, it was really cold and none of us really had warm jackets, so we didn't want to get caught out in the cold or be out a group of 4 girls by ourselves.
Okay. How much alcohol was consumed by you or the other people that you were interacting with that night?
I probably had a water bottle full of vodka. Stop.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I'm glad that you're making friends, and I'm glad that you kind of wanted to make a safer decision. But let's just talk about like drinking in general. Here on campus, we're a dry campus. You're not supposed to be drinking in the dorms. We don't want anyone underage drinking, but we also have a realistic viewpoint that those coming into college may make choices with alcohol. We don't want to make any judgments on that, but we want to make sure you're safe. So can you just talk to me about some of your drinking habits, maybe on like a weekly basis? What do you do? How much do you consume socially? Just some of those things.
I mean, I'm just going to be honest with you. I grew up my later years of high school with my parents being comfortable with me drinking as long as they were present. They wanted to make sure I reacted well because they knew and they were realistic that I was going to drink in college. So I mean, I can have about 5 or 6 beers. I mean, I get drunk, but I don't black out or like throw up.
1 minute.
Okay. So you talked about being safe. Do you feel that maybe some of the behaviors that you did that night or some of the steps that you took that night maybe weren't so safe for you?
I mean, I think we were being safe because we didn't want to walk out in the cold, but I mean, obviously we drank alcohol and that's not very safe.
And the last question that I'll have for her is, do you feel that there's been any impacts from that night on you currently, or do you see that maybe there might be impacts on your future at all?
I guess it's just kind of embarrassing. I have to go talk to my RA, who like doesn't seem that much older than me, to talk about my drinking habits, and it it's just kind of embarrassing. I feel like a child.
Cool. All right, so you probably talk a little bit more about their future and dig into more of their habits there, but there's kind of a quick overview. So you would see that we handed out a list of creative sanctions for alcohol. This is pulled from American College Personnel Association, where a bunch of universities got together and made a list of creative sanctions. There's over 50 here. So I want you to just look over it and maybe pick 2 that you would think would be good. And we'll give you about maybe 2 minutes to do that.
Let's do a minute.
A minute?
Yeah.
So.
Sorry, housing and residence life friends.
No, like any of these.
Yeah, you can pick any of the ones that are there, or if you have experience or something that you would rather do that's not on that list, that's cool. But we didn't want you to make them up on your own, especially if you didn't have experience. These are examples of educational sanctions that other universities give. Can you let us read Jane? Who wants to know when a minute's up?
Oh, yeah.
I kind of like the one that says you have to attend an AA or support group meeting and then write a paper on it. Although I feel like I'm curious how serious like people take the papers when they have to write them. Like that's why I kind of like that they have to go do something along with it.
All right, let's come back. Let's hear from 3 different people just really quick. We don't need to go into description, but just what did you choose for me? Dana.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily choose this for you, but I thought 14 pretty sober, and our response was really interesting, though, like on a dry campus, that would probably not be.
I saw someone over here and then Bethany. Anyone? No? Okay, Bethany?
Oh, we liked the like volunteer at the detox because an action piece I think can be more about the groups, right?
Definitely, especially with my like okayness with drinking alcohol.
Yeah.
One more. Okay, well we're gonna move on.
Okay, so that's kind of, like we said, the educational approach, but there are laws that do impact working in judicial affairs, and one of them is,
FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, which you'll see a lot in academic advising and a lot of different functional areas. So it's a student's right to privacy, so unless they allow a parent to know this information about them, anything that's in the directory is the only thing that you can disclose to anyone who asks.
another one is the Student Right to Know and Campus Security Act. This was added onto FERPA in 1990, and that's for those who are alleged survivors of sexual misconduct. They have if they report that incident, they have the right to know the outcome of that meeting. Leading into that kind of leads into Title IX. Whether or not you'll deal with sexual misconduct as a judicial affairs professional depends on the campus, but you should have a Title IX coordinator. So if you deal with sexual misconduct, it is your responsibility to let the Title IX coordinator know. It has to be reported, it has to be filed. The university needs that information. You don't have to force that person to report about it, but it does need to be filed. And then First Amendment, the university has certain restrictions on how much they can put policies around freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Some contemporary issues that student conduct is facing, and first is academic integrity. A lot of our interviewers said that this has been a trend. Like, it is happening more often than it has been in the past. It's much more common. Also, the First Amendment kind of thing, and hate speeches. Maybe not someone making a threat against a group, but actively talking out against a group of people in public. Do we need to make this a policy thing? Should we have student conduct meetings based on this? Legalism versus developmentalism. A lot of new laws and procedures are coming in, and some people feel it's constraining judicial affairs and moving more towards the development of the student to making sure that we are following all these laws and being more like a court system. Title IX, which I discussed, and then diversity. Sometimes people's cultures really do clash with the process and some of the policies of the university. Lastly, one that wasn't on there that I just thought of is also mental illness and and counseling, because you're not a counselor. You might have some of those things, but you're not a psychologist, and those come up sometimes.
So some
5
interview
minutes.
tips, which we
5
will-
minutes until 20, so make sure you leave time
Oh.
for questions.
Yep.
Some interview tips from some of the people that we interviewed. Nathaniel Schultz, he is the director of student conduct at UMD. He is only 28, 29 years old, so he's a very young director for being at a very large university. And he came from a counseling background from St. Cloud State University, so their different approaches was interesting. So he said, show that you understand, they're more likely to open up to you. And so he always said that he was very realistic with them. To self-disclose, he bounces at one of the local bars sometimes, so he kind of had that awkward, like, I'm a bouncer outside, but then I'm talking to you about drinking here. So I found that was really interesting.
And then we had Jim Sachs. He's the assistant dean of students at UST. He has a different background. He was actually an attorney before he went into student affairs. So you can read the advice, but I'm just going to point out my favorites. I like that he said, don't be afraid to show you're upset. Sometimes I think students don't realize like how unsafe they were. So sometimes if you show you're upset, that kind of sinks in a little bit more. I also think he said having a good sense of humor and patience. Humor in judicial affairs seems silly, but I think you need it. And then lastly, know your blind spots. What biases are you coming in with? He talked about being a parent and how that kind of creates his bias when he goes.
Megan Rugel, I think I pronounced that correctly. Rugel?
Yes, you did.
She has just been in her position. She's moved from an orientation background to judicial affairs. And she said treat them as individuals. One approach won't work for everyone, so it depends on, say, like in my situation, I came from a family who was okay with drinking. You might have a student who was like feared of drinking in college or high school and got to college and goes crazy. And then kind of going along with that, she said have consistency in your sanctions. So they have different people meet with students, and so if two best friends are at a party and they both get busted, but they meet with two different individuals and get different disciplinary actions, they're like, well, how come Jennifer just got this sanction and I got this? So you have to be consistent in those.
Just another thing I want to put out, she said detach compassion, which means be compassionate in the moment, but you need to compartmentalize it because you can't take home all the problems. And then next is Javier. And Javier, he is the assistant dean of students at Hamlin. He works a little differently because he's in residence life as well, so he deals with on-campus student conduct. And a lot of things that we talked about are kind of mirrored here, but to point out some important things, he said, explain that it's not a court system. One of the issues is that students try to make it like the law. It's not. You can make a judgment based on what most likely happened. Also, be aware of cultural, religious, and gender differences. And then two things that I didn't think about, administrative skills are very important because you have to do reports. And then be up on social media because a lot of the evidence comes from social media, so you need to understand it.
So some benefits and difficulties. You kind of get a little touch in a bunch of different areas in student affairs, and realizing that you've changed someone's life. It doesn't happen very often, I heard, but a student might write back to you a few years later and say thank you for kind of opening up my eyes, and that can go a long ways. Difficulties, parents, obviously, they want to know what happened to their student and why they're being disciplined. And not being able, or the students who bring in a law, they make the lawyer call, like, well, I'm going to call my lawyer because I can drink.
The other things are, last thing, there's sub-areas in student affairs if you're interested. So you can work with fraternity sorority life, residence life, Title IX, different areas. So basically, we had questions for you, but I don't know if we have time, so let's just go to
Yeah, you have a minute and a half total.
questions for us.
Yeah, let's do questions.
I don't know. Whoever you want.
Dana.
Dana.
Could you expand on the social media use at all? Just like, because I feel like as a student, we were like, that's our own guy.
Yep. I guess I can speak on that from experience in my role in student government and having students tweet about being at parties and working with student conduct. It's like those overheard posts or whatever. A student can be really racially discriminating on those sites. And then there's that fine line between freedom of speech and then offending students. So I know student conduct has hit roadblocks and like what they can do. I saw a student post something from a Moodle discussion that someone said something really funny. They misspelled something or whatever and posted it on Overheard at UMD. And he got in trouble with it. And he was an awesome student. He was an orientation leader. He was a peer educator. And he like didn't realize that was an issue and got pretty nasty email about it. So.
I think it's like additional evidence. Usually there's like a report, someone saw it, and then you can get additional evidence from social media. I don't think that they're like, oh, I saw this picture you're being sent. Like, I think that's how it kind of comes into play most of the time. I'm not 100% sure.
So, for the people that you interviewed, did they mention how they have to, I guess we can talk about like the sexual violence and sexual assault, so they mentioned to the new updated violence against women act, and how they are need to start really pushing this effort for more of that confidentiality and the process?
They really just talked about Title IX the most,
Yeah.
honestly.
And we try to keep it like targeted towards, it's so broad sometimes, the majority of the universities.
And in judicial affairs, what seemed to be most common, but again, we only had a small amount of people that we talked to in literature reviews, it tends to be more under a different person than with judicial affairs, but it does happen sometimes.
I'm gonna call time.